Let's break this down with Dimitri Burshtein, Principal at Eminence Advisory and a columnist at The Australian. Dimitri, welcome and thank you for joining me tonight. Inflation is running far too high, but isn't this largely the hangover from state government lockdown policies during the pandemic?
Thanks for having me on your show, Amanda. Well, it was actually a team effort. It was a combination of the states, territories, and the Commonwealth and the RBA. As Milton Friedman said, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. The RBA produced more money than the economy could handle, and the states and Commonwealth spent too much. So it was a team effort.
Yep, fair cop. There is that fiscal side to the story, though, about what governments spend. What should Labor be doing on the policy and budget front to tackle the drivers of inflation?
Well, the roadmap is already there. The lessons are there from the 70s and 80s in the United States, from the 80s and 90s in Australia. The Great Inflation was the period into the 1960s and 70s and early 80s in the United States. It's referred to as the Great Inflation because of the huge amount of inflation that burdened the US economy and was spread throughout. It was caused by three principal phenomena. The central bank was printing too much money to finance the government's spending, principally to finance the war in Vietnam, and new welfare programs that came out of the Lyndon Johnson Great Society reforms. And also the US economy was sluggish because of years of regulation. What was done with it? Well, to address it, there was the Central Bank of the United States, the US Federal Reserve, tightened monetary policy. Interest rates went much, much higher. The Reagan administration cut government spending extensively and taxing extensively, and also deregulated the economy to allow the economy to thrive. The same thing happened in Australia in the 80s and 90s. The economic team of Bob Hawke, Paul Keating and Peter Walsh, they did the very same thing. The central bank, which was not independent at the time, it tightened monetary policy. The government did a major reduction of expenditure. At the time, I think it bottomed at around 22% of GDP, Commonwealth spending, and that is including the social wage reforms that the Commonwealth implemented. At the moment, we're tracking at around 27%. The other thing that was done was a major productivity reform through deregulation and basically getting the government out of the way to let the economy produce. So we've seen this stuff before. If we bring it forward to today, the RBA is doing the heavy lifting at the moment. The Commonwealth and the states, for that matter, are still spending too much. Granted, there is the last financial year that concluded, a couple of days ago, there will be a budget surplus. The amount is to be determined. They're still spending too much. 26 to 27% of GDP is way too much. And when you add in the state and territory figures, we're talking about in excess of 35, 36, 37% of GDP is consumed by government.
Yeah, I think you're right, that while that monetary policy and interest rate change is happening, there's a real absence of restraint in spending from the government books, and there is a real absence of deregulation and productivity reform. And unless we get real about that, this problem's going to last a whole lot longer. There's been news coverage indicating that Dr. Chalmers' decision to delay making a decision on the future of Mr. Lowe will shortchange Australians by limiting the breadth of the search that can be done for a replacement. Are those critics making a fair assessment?
I don't think so. I think there was a number of names that were ventilated last week. Stephen Kennedy, the current head of the Treasury, Martin Parkinson, former Treasury head, and a former head of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the current head of the Department of Finance. There's a lot of names being bandied around. I think it's premature to assume that Chalmers his contract won't be extended, because it's unclear what better job the current candidates will do, particularly given the governance reforms that the recent RBA review announced. So I think this is a quiet process. and that people will, the ventilating of those names that were mentioned last week will attract other applicants to quietly, put their hand up. What decision will be ultimately made? I mean, whilst it is at the behest of Treasurer Chalmers, it's really a cabinet decision. He'll have to make a recommendation to cabinet, and they'll have to make a decision on that.
Dimitri Burshtein, thank you so much for your time and insight tonight.